In September of 2007, Apple released the first ever iPod Touch. However, if you were on Apple's website today and tried searching for it, you would be left with no results. When you shop for iOS devices, the iPod Touch is rarely even considered, but if you're one of the few people looking to get this device here in 2024, you're on the right track because in this video, we're going to be comparing every single model of this device. Now, let's actually take a look at the designs of all these iPods here. So we're going to start with the first generation, and the first thing that I noticed is that on the back, there's no actual camera. And I did some more research on this, and it turns out there's no microphone on this device either. Now, if we compare this to the first iPhone, you'll see that on the top, there's supposed to be speakers, but for some reason, there isn't. Apple decided to not add them onto the iPod for whatever reason. And the last thing is that if we compare the thickness of these two devices, you'll see that the iPod Touch is a lot thinner. And moving on to the second generation iPod Touch, you'll see that the second generation looks basically the exact same. The antenna does look a bit different, and it does feel a bit more round on the back, but besides that, they're almost the same design. And this also goes for the third generation. The only way to tell these two apart is these two logos right here. The second generation has a larger storage symbol, but that's really the only way to tell these two apart. Now let's actually move on to the fourth generation iPod Touch. And despite the fact that this device came out just 1 year later, it comes with two cameras. And on top of that, the bottom has speakers now. And what else I noticed is that it does actually come with a microphone on it. And that is basically all there is for the 2010 iPod Touch. Now, something you should know is that up to this point, Apple is releasing these devices every single year. But for some reason, Apple decided to skip 2011 and they released this 2 years later. So the iPod Touch 5 was a taller device, although not wider. And on the back, you can see that since it was made out of aluminum, it doesn't get scratched as easily. And this right here was supposed to be a lanyard holder, so it was supposed to replace the need for getting a case, but very few people actually ended up using it. Now, just 6 months later, Apple released this version of the fifth generation, which didn't have a camera, as well as no lanyard hole. And this also only came in one color, which was a mix between black and silver. And you can tell that Apple is trying to save money here because they put plastic buttons, but the software was basically entirely the same on this device. After the fifth generation, Apple almost entirely ditched the iPod because Apple only continued updating these devices every 3 to 4 years just to keep them up to date with the latest software versions. So on the outside, they're basically the exact same, and they also have the exact same displays. The only differences are with the speeds and several other minor features. Apple ultimately discontinued the iPod Touch 7th generation in 2022, which was far later than expected considering that their competitors had discontinued their devices almost a decade earlier. I will actually go over why the iPod Touch failed later in the video, so be sure to stick around for that. So let's actually move on to a camera test of all of these devices. And we're going to start with the fourth generation since all the other ones don't have cameras on them. And what I actually find interesting about the old camera is that on the camera app, there's very few options here. So if I press on the options button, you'll see that the only option is grid. And that means you cannot really select any filters, and you'll see that the only options are photo and video. So first off, we're going to do a photo test with the fourth generation iPod Touch, as well as the rest of the devices, and then we're going to move on to the video. And here's what the photo looks like on the 14-year-old iPod Touch. It's definitely not good quality, but at the same time, it is still considered very high-end at the time. So let's move on to the fifth generation iPod Touch. And you could already tell from the increased camera size and the image quality that it's going to be better. So if we take a look at the camera app software, and if we open this, you'll see that there's a ton of new options here, including square, panorama, as well as time-lapse, but no slow-mo. And if we go to the photo option, you'll see that there's a separate button for filters, and there's also the option for flash, since the fifth generation iPod Touch was the first one to actually add a flashlight. So let's actually move on to the photo test. And you can tell that the quality of the camera has improved quite a lot here. It's less grainy, but the most notable difference is the improved lighting. Now I'm actually curious about how the cameras compare on the 6th and 7th generations compared to the 5th, and that's because the camera is like the exact same on all three of these devices from the outside. So let's actually take a look at the camera software, and you'll see that there's a brand new option here for slow-mo, but everything else seems to be the exact same. Now, because there's a new slow-mo option here in the camera app, I do think that the video will have a higher frame rate, but let's now get into the photo test. So here's what a photo looks like, and you can tell that there isn't a huge difference, but the lighting has definitely improved. So moving on to the 7th generation, there's nothing else to show before the photo test, since it's almost the exact same. So let's try taking a photo on this device, and here's what the photo looks like. You can see that it looks basically the exact same as the one on the 6th generation. I couldn't really find any differences, which is quite disappointing. Now, in case you're wondering how many megapixels each one of these cameras have, the 4th generation has 0.7 megapixels, the 5th has 5, and the 6th and 7th generations both have 8 megapixel cameras. Now, let's finish off this camera comparison with a video test of all 4 of these devices. And we're going to start off with a 4th generation iPod Touch. So here's what video looks like on a 14-year-old iPod Touch, and obviously it's not all that good right now, but 14 years back when it was released, it was revolutionary, especially considering that this device costed just $300. And let's try focusing on the first ever iPhone, that way you can see the details. And I should also mention that this device records at HD at 30 frames per second. So here's what video looks like on the 5th generation iPod Touch, so you can actually tell that it's a lot less grainy now. And let's try focusing on the first iPhone so you can see the detail. And the lighting is actually really awful here. And in case you don't know, this iPod Touch records at full HD at 30 frames per second. So here's what video looks like on the 6th generation iPod Touch, and you can tell that the video quality has improved quite a lot, and that is because it can now record at 60 frames per second, but Apple doesn't give you the option to enable that. Instead, they just use it to improve the video quality. And let's actually try focusing on the first iPhone, that way you can see the details, and you can already tell that the lighting has improved quite a lot. Now here's the quality of a 7th generation iPod Touch camera, and it's almost the same as one on the 6th generation. Let's try focusing on the first iPhone again, and I do think the lighting has actually improved quite a bit, but other than that, the cameras are basically the same. Now let's move on to the displays of all of these devices. So first off, we've got the first 3 iPod Touches here, which all have a 320 by 480 display, which go at 163 pixels per inch. The 4th generation iPod Touch goes at 326 pixels per inch, and the screen resolution is 960 by 640. The rest of these iPods you see here that come after 2012 have screen resolutions that are still 326 pixels per inch, but because they are taller, they have screen resolutions of 1136 by 640. So these first 4 iPods have 3.5 inch screens diagonally, and the rest of these have 4 inch screens, which is the same size as the ones on the iPhone 5. And by the way, they are all multi-touch. Now let's talk about the speeds of all these iPod Touches. So we're going to start with the first generation, which has 128 megabytes of RAM, and it does also have the same chip that is from the first iPhone. Then the 2nd generation iPod Touch still has the same amount of RAM, and it still has the same chip from the iPhone 3G. The 3rd generation iPod Touch has 256 megabytes of RAM, and it has the same chip from the iPhone 3GS. And then the iPod Touch 4th generation has the A4 chip that is from the iPhone 4, and it has 256 megabytes of RAM. Then the 5th generation iPod Touch, which came out 2 years later, has half a gigabyte of RAM, and it also has the Apple A5 chip, which is from the iPhone 4S, which was already a year old at the time of its release. And this is also true for the budget version of the 5th generation. Then the iPod Touch 6th generation, which came out in 2015, has an A8 chip, and it has 1 gigabyte of RAM, so this is about the same speed as an iPhone 6 or 5S. And then the last iPod Touch ever made had 2 gigabytes of RAM and the Apple A10 chip, so this is about the same speed as the iPhone 6S or iPhone 7. Now do keep in mind that these chips are underclocked, so they're not going to be as good as the ones on the iPhone. Now let's go over the software versions of all of these iPod Touches here. So we're going to start with the first generation, and for whatever reason, it got unsupported within a year after its release because it can only go up to iPhone OS 1.1.5. The second iPod Touch goes up to iOS 4.2.1, but it can actually be downgraded to iOS 4.1. As for the third generation, it goes up to iOS 5.1.1. As you can see here, mine is just not on the latest version, but you can actually downgrade it to iOS 4.1. The fourth generation, as you can see here, it goes up to iOS 6.1.6. And the fifth generation gets iOS 9.3.5. That also goes for the budget version that you see here without a camera. And the sixth gen goes up to iOS 12.5.7. And the seventh generation gets iOS 15. And this one still gets the occasional security updates, so although you don't get the latest iOS features, you do still get bug fixes. Now let's go over the batteries of all these iPods here. So the first four might be a bit inaccurate because it was hard to find information about them, but the last four, the fifth generation and later, have battery lives of 1043 milliamp hours. And they are able to stay on for 5 hours at a time. And if it's turned off, just playing audio, it can actually last a full 24 hours. Keep in mind that this information came straight from Apple, so it's inaccurate. And let's now cover the first four iPod Touches. So the first one has a battery life of 789 milliamp hours, and this was the same for the second and third generation iPod Touches. The fourth generation has a battery life of 930 milliamp hours. So that's all there is to cover for the battery life of the iPod Touch. Now you might be wondering, why did the iPod Touch fail? Well, it's for a couple reasons. First off, when this device, as well as the iPhone, first came out, the iPod Touch was seen as a cheaper alternative to the iPhone. But several years later, when newer phones came out, adults were able to just buy refurbished, older iPhones for a cheaper price. So that's what made the iPod Touch obsolete for them. So what stopped children from using the iPod Touch was the invention of the iPad. So this came out in 2010, and because children would rather use a tablet type of device rather than a smaller device like the iPod Touch, the iPad quickly replaced it. So what is the future of the iPod Touch? Well, the reality is that there isn't a future. The iPod Touch 7 was already discontinued over 3 years ago, and the iPads, as well as the cheaper model iPhones, have already replaced this device. So that is it for the complete iPod Touch comparison in 2024. I hope this video helped you out, and if it did, be sure to like, subscribe, and check out my channel to see more tech videos.